Good afternoon, friends. I'm Joe Chuman, and I'd like to welcome you to what is the first of our fall programs that involve interviews with noted writers on contemporary issues. And I should say we have a very exciting, relevant, and interesting, and I'm sure engaging discussion ahead of us this afternoon. I'm going to be interviewing Professor Randall Balmer on his most recent book entitled Bad Faith. Here it is, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Before I introduce Randall Balmer, let me just say a little bit about myself. I've been conducting these interviews under the auspice of the Puffin Cultural Forum for many years. I am a part-time leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and I have taught religion and human rights for many years at Columbia University and at Hunter College. Now, a little bit about Randall Balmer. Randall Balmer is a professor of religion at Dartmouth College, and for many years served as the chair of the religion department at Barnard College in New York City. Randy is one of America's foremost authorities on evangelical Christianity. He's written more than 25 books, including books on Jimmy Carter, the religious backgrounds of American presidents since the Second World War, and he's written many books on the history and politics and culture of American evangelicals. And his writing has served as the basis for several PBS television specials, some of which have won awards. I remember one that he did several years ago on Billy Graham, but there have been others on evangelicals more broadly. And I can't basically render this introduction by saying that Randy is an old friend. We were both pursuing our doctorates in religion at the same time, Randall Balmer at Princeton University and I at Columbia. And Randy went on to have a very distinguished career as a scholar and an academic at Columbia, at Barnard, and more recently at Dartmouth. And I developed a career primarily in the ethical culture movement. Haven't seen Randall for many years, so it's really great to be back with him. And for me, this is an exciting moment. Randy, I have the book you wrote on Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. As I understand it, its primary thesis is basically to correct a misunderstanding as to what inspired American evangelicals to repoliticize themselves in the late 1970s. And we'll talk about that. But well, let me ask you this. Let me start this way. We obviously are in a very charged political moment. I think our democracy, from my standpoint, is hanging at a precipice. I think many of us are very concerned, very anxious, doing what we can to try to preserve American democracy. And I'm wondering why you chose to write this book at this political moment. Right.
Well,
I mean, I can't see your book divorced from the political moment.
No,
Right?
that's true.
Right.
No, well, first of all, Joe, it's great to see you and great to be in communication again. So thanks for having me.
Sure, it's great.
Always fun to talk. Yeah, certainly the political moment seemed to call for a book like this. I guess a more sort of mercenary motivation was I did a piece in Politico back in 2014 about the real origins of the religious right, and to be honest, I kind of dashed it off because it's something I've certainly been talking about and writing about for a long time and doing research on the topic. But at one time, Politico told me it was the most popular article they'd ever published, and I'm sure that's no longer the case. But I kept getting responses about that article about the real origins of the religious right. And again, in this political moment, I thought, here's a chance for me to kind of update that argument, and as a way also of trying to explain Donald Trump and the evangelical support for Donald Trump. I also wanted to be able to in effect, show my work. That is to say, add footnotes into this argument so that people will know I'm not making this up. That is, I've done the research. And I did. I did research in several presidential libraries. I did research in the archives at Liberty University, Bob Jones University, and in Paul Wyrick's papers, which are actually out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, of all places. And as well as conversations with various people over the years. So the book offered me a chance to kind of solidify the argument with information that I'd come across since publishing that political piece, but also to provide the infrastructure, the academic, the scholarly infrastructure that would show that.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up.
Well, no, and your thesis deserves it. It's a very important one. And maybe we'll start off with that. There are a lot of ancillary questions I want to ask, including how one can explain the evangelical infatuation with Donald Trump, given their promotion purportedly of so-called family values for so many years. I think they've gotten off that kick, but I haven't heard it recently. But we'll have to talk about that. But first, why don't you just tell us what the thesis of the book is?
Well, it's really a two-part thesis. One is to expose and I think demolish what I call the abortion myth, which is the fiction that evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision. Now, I can go through some of that evidence now, or do you want to come back to that a little bit later?
Yeah, we can come back to it later. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was the first part of it. And I can say, without fear of contradiction, that abortion was not the motivation for evangelical political activism in the 1970s. And I should say, to set that up, and you alluded to it earlier in your earlier remarks, for roughly half a century before the 70s, the mid-1970s, evangelicals were really politically quiescent. Now, you had a few kind of outliers, people like Carl McIntyre and Fighting Bob Schuler and people like that who were making political noise. But really, since the Scopes trial of 1925, evangelicals were hunkered down in what I call the evangelical subculture, and they were not active politically, certainly not in any organized way. And that's the background for understanding their emergence in the 1970s. All of a sudden, they decided to become politically active. And the question was, what was the catalyst for their mobilization in the 1970s? And the answer that the leaders of the religious right kept giving over and over again was, we were concerned about abortion. Well, again, the abortion myth puts that to rest, I think, quite solidly. So the second part is to explore what really was the catalyst for the emergence of the religious right. And as a spoiler, I can say, again, without worry of contradiction, and this is from the leaders of the religious right itself, the catalyst was a defense of racial segregation in evangelical schools, principally Bob Jones University, but also so-called segregation academies that, of course, had risen up in response to the desegregation of public education.
Yeah, I want to talk about the details of that, which is really, again, the gist of your thesis. But at the beginning of the book, you do give us a brief history of the evangelical movement in America, and you clarify some terms. And I think it's important for our general viewers to get a more comprehensive understanding of who evangelicals are, where they come from, and so forth. So if you can tell us about
Sure.
Their emergence in the United States, I guess, in the early 19th century.
Yeah, well, first of all, let's do a quick definition. I have a three-part definition for evangelical. Evangelical is somebody who takes the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity. And that frequently entails biblical literalism, although evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism when they approach the Bible. The second criterion is that evangelicals believe in the centrality of conversion or a born-again experience. And this comes from the third chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, the Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night because he doesn't want to be seen with Jesus, and asks Jesus how he, Nicodemus, can enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus replies, you must be born again, or born from above, which evangelicals typically understand as a instantaneous, dateable experience when they turn away from their sinful past and embrace the gospel, embrace Jesus. The third criterion is an evangelical is somebody who proselytizes. That tends to be a pejorative term, so I probably should use the term evangelize instead. That is, he or she feels compelled to bring others into the faith. And so those three definitions comprise what would be for me an evangelical. In terms of numbers, most polling data these days suggest that about 1/3 of the population in the United States would fit into that category. So it's a huge movement. It's also an internally diverse movement. That is to say, you have within that larger umbrella, you've got fundamentalists, you got Pentecostals, holiness people, a growing number of Latino evangelicals and Latina as well. A Southern Baptist Convention would fit into that category as well. So it's a huge, but it's also an internally diverse movement.
You also have black and white churches.
Absolutely. Black churches, yes, I should have said that as well.
I think one thing that I think we have to clear up, because I think there's a misunderstanding in the general culture, is the difference between evangelicals and fundamentalists.
It's mostly a matter of disposition. Jerry Falwell himself said that a fundamentalist was an evangelical who's mad about something. And that's a pretty good definition. It's not so much a theological difference as it is a sense of disposition. So there is a militancy to fundamentalism that you don't find in evangelicals. People like Billy Graham would be, in many ways, the kind of iconic representation of evangelicals. Being quite ironic and not militant, not separatist, the way you have with fundamentalists.
Yeah, okay, let me ask, we're going to be talking about the Christian right and evangelicals in their conservative political manifestations, which we can assume are the vast majority, but there are, in effect, moderate and even liberal evangelicals.
Oh, yes.
And I think it's important to know that. Am I correct by saying, well, we think of Jimmy Carter, for example, as being, right, I guess, politically a man of the center, okay? And for our discussion becomes basically very progressive in terms of the issue we're going to be talking about. But right. Is it correct that both Bill Clinton and even Al Gore identify as evangelicals? Do you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I don't remember if either of them has used that term specifically, but I think that it's fair to say that they are. I guess when I think of liberal evangelical, I think about probably Sojourners, Jim Wallace, and that movement. I think is probably the best representation of that. But there are a good number of other people who are associated with that wing of evangelicalism. And it's probably larger than we think. It's just that they don't have the same sort of media empire behind them that people like James Dobson or Falwell, Robertson, and these other figures did.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the history, the origins of evangelicals in the United States and how they transform. You talk about a theological transformation in, I guess, the late 19th, early 20th century among evangelicals.
Well, I usually I push it back to the middle of the 18th century with this huge awakening that occurred that historians call the Great Awakening along the Atlantic seaboard, from Georgia all the way up into Massachusetts. And there you had the intermingling of what I call the 3 Ps. And this is a movement that combined the vestiges of New England Puritanism, Scots-Irish Presbyterianism, and continental pietism. And they all came together in this movement that became known as the Great Awakening. And I think it's still possible, by the way, to find remnants of each of those Ps in contemporary evangelicalism. That is to say, many evangelicals inherited from the Puritans the importance of an introspective piety. That is, they were always looking inward to see where they were on their journey toward heaven, toward salvation. I think from the Presbyterians, contemporary evangelicals have a sense of doctrinal precisionism. That is, it's important to believe the right things, to have the right theology. And third, I think from continental pietism, they have the importance of this affective or a very emotional piety, this sort of warm-hearted religion. And I think, again, all three of those P's are present in contemporary evangelicalism. So you have the First Great Awakening that brings these together. In many ways, the Second Great Awakening, which straddled the decades surrounding the turn of the 19th century, was a time when evangelicalism adopted many of its current forms. That is to say, it became very much a populist movement, very democratic, lowercase d democratic, in the sense that anybody could come to the faith. It wasn't reserved strictly for the elect, the way the Puritans had argued. And I think you also had the importance of religious ecstasy, particularly coming out of the camp meeting revivals around the turn of the 19th century. And even more important, I think, was the mandate for social reform coming out of that Second Great Awakening, particularly under Charles Grandison Finney, without any doubt, the most influential evangelical of the 19th century. And Finney believed that benevolence was a mandate for the regenerated Christian. And so coming out of that Great Awakening is this remarkable surge of reform, prison reform, the whole idea of a penitentiary, for example, education, common schools as they were known in the 19th century, was very much an evangelical concern, because evangelicals wanted to lift those in the lower rungs of society into the middle class, to make sure that they had a chance to become upwardly mobile. Women's rights, women's equality came out of that movement. The campaign against dueling was spearheaded in many ways by Lyman Beecher. That came out of the Second Great Awakening as well. And they were trying to remake society according to the norms of godliness. And what I find remarkable about evangelical activism during this period is the remarkable extent to which evangelicals were concerned about those on the margins of society. Now, they didn't always get it right. I'm not claiming they did. And it's certainly true that many Southern evangelicals and evangelical theologians defended slavery. But nevertheless, if you look at the overall body of work for evangelical social reformers in the early part of the 19th century, it would be considered very much liberal by today's political standards. And so that was an important moment.
Well, what about, you talk about evangelicals in the South endorsing slavery, and undoubtedly many were slaveholders, but what about in the North? Were they at all active in the abolitionist movement?
Oh, they were active in the abolitionist movement, absolutely, particularly Wesleyan Methodist Church, for example, pre-Methodists would be another example. Now, they weren't, I wouldn't say that 100% of evangelicals were abolitionists, but they were certainly involved in that movement. There's no question about that. And that was one of the reforms they tried to bring about in society.
Yeah, I had read a while back, just to divert a little bit, I read Joe Lepore's Magisterial History of the United States, These Truths, which I thought was just absolutely marvelous. And I remember listening to a lecture by her, and she said, somebody asked her what she had learned by researching her book. And she said the most startling thing that she had learned that impressed her was the role of evangelicals in that period in terms of promoting the electoral franchise, that their populism in that case activated people to get involved in electoral politics, which for her was an eye-opener, which is an interesting, sort of comports with what you're saying in this regard. Yeah, it was an interesting, okay, let's get down to your thesis. Okay. And that is, the question is, what were the causes that motivated, inspired evangelicals in the 1970s to move out of a position of political quiescence, right, where involvement in politics was doing Satan's work, right, and to become repoliticized? And I should say, and this is my editorializing, I think there's been probably no movement in the last 50 years that has been so influential in transforming American politics in ways that I think threaten my own worldview, and that is moving it far to the right, as that politicization of the huge evangelical subculture into political activism. What was the cause of that? Let's be explicit and unpack it, because that's really your thesis. Yeah.
Yeah, and first of all, and as I begin that response, I utterly concur. I think the religious right has utterly remade the American political landscape over the last 40 years, 40 plus years now, and I think you're absolutely right. It's been pivotal for understanding our current political moment. I want to start, if I could, Joe, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about the abortion myth and why the standard narrative, narrative does not work. Can I do that in a little bit? Just
please, of course. Right. Go ahead, please. Okay. Yeah.
So again, the abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals mobilized in the 1970s in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. Again, you've heard that, everybody's heard that over and over and over again. That's why we got into politics. We just couldn't countenance this moral travesty of legalized abortion. Well, the real story is rather more complicated. In 1968, Christianity Today, which is the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, joined with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society for a several-day conference that discussed the morality surrounding abortion. And 26 heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world gathered here. They did their conferring, and they concluded at the end of that session that they could not conclude that that abortion was morally wrong, that it should be allowed in certain instances. Two successive editors of Christianity Today, again, that magazine that's really the flagship for evangelicalism, offered a highly nuanced views on the abortion issue, views that allowed for the legalization of abortion. In 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, not known as a redoubt of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974 after the Roe v. Wade ruling, and again in 1976. When the ruling was handed down, W.A. Criswell, a former president of the Southern Baptist Convention and pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade decision. And even James Dobson, who later, of course, became an implacable foe of abortion, in 1973 acknowledged that the Bible was silent on the issue of abortion, and also that it was perfectly reasonable for an evangelical to regard a fetus as something less than a human being. Finally, Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. So this is what I call the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that evangelicals became politically active in the 1970s in response to Roe v. Wade. It's just simply not true. And I will add one little footnote to that, and that is that when Ronald Reagan addressed 15 to 20,000 screaming evangelicals on August 22nd, 1980, reunion arena in Dallas, this is where he famously said, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing," brought down the house. In that speech, which I read out at the Reagan Presidential Library, in that speech, he talked about creationism. He criticized Jimmy Carter's Internal Revenue Service for going after the tax exemption of evangelical schools. He did not mention abortion even once. August 22nd, 1980.
Okay.
So,
okay, then let's unpack then. Let's unpack the cause, the motivation for the repoliticization of the evangelical subculture. It was not abortion.
It was not abortion, and I began to see this actually in this meeting in Washington, D.C. that took place in November 1990. when I had been invited down. I was at that time at Columbia as an assistant professor, and I had been invited down to Washington for a meeting. And I got into this closed door meeting with in a hotel conference room, and there was Ralph Reed, head of the Christian Coalition, Richard Land from the Southern Baptist Convention, Donald Wildman, who founded the American Family Association, Ed Dobson, who had been one of Falwell's lieutenants at Moral Majority, Richard Viguerie, the conservative direct mail guru, and Paul Weyrich, the head of the Heritage Foundation, who is really the architect of the religious right. And so I'm in this gathering, and all of a sudden in the first session, Paul Weyrich makes this impassioned speech. He says, let's remember, this movement, meaning the religious right, did not get started in response to abortion. Abortion had nothing to do with this. And very quickly thereafter, Ed Dobson, Falwell's lieutenant at Moral Majority, concurred with exactly what Weyrich was saying. So immediately after that session, I went to Weyrich and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do with it. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign to get these people, meaning evangelicals, mobilized for political ends. He said, I tried the abortion issue, I tried the pornography issue, I tried the women's rights issue, I tried the school prayer issue. Nothing got their attention until the 1970s, mid-1970s, when the Internal Revenue Service began challenging the tax exemption of segregation academies and Bob Jones University. And that, he said, was the catalyst for the religious right.
Okay.
So that's got me started.
Well, let's put this in a historical context. The title of your book, Bad Faith, is Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Let's talk about the racial, or we might even argue racist dimensions that inspired the religious right to repoliticize. We have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that mandated the integration of the public schools. Now, am I correct in saying that many evangelicals, I guess primarily in the South, responded to that by starting their own Christian academies, their own private schools that had to be integrated in order to continue to receive tax exemptions, but they were not. They were basically set up in order to avoid integration, that is, to move away from Blacks, right, and so forth. And it was that inspired the Carter administration and Jimmy Carter, working through the IRS, to remove their tax exemption. Is that, in brief, the unfolding of that issue?
Pretty much, except for the Carter.
Okay, what is the role? I mean, Jimmy Carter, in some senses, you could argue, is a type of tragic figure here. I mean, on the one hand, he's the first, when he claimed when he was inaugurated, he was a born-again Christian. I think the Northern journalists had to go to their religious dictionaries to basically, try to understand what the guy was talking about. I mean, it was not known. He was a proud evangelical and born-again Christian, and I assume received a great deal of approbation from fellow evangelicals at that point, right?
Well, for
initially,
for the election, for the presidential election, 1976. Yes, I mean, what hurt him right at the end was he was heading toward a landslide, if you remember correctly, during that campaign. And then the Playboy interview came out, and he lost 15% in his popularity. So it turned out to be a very close election, but. Yes. So in terms of evangelical mobilization, Jimmy Carter is very important in this story because he brings them into the political arena. And many of them voted for Carter, I think, merely for the novelty of being able to vote for one of their own for president. I think they thought that was just unthinkable at the time. Carter comes along and says, I'm a born again Christian. He's unabashed about it. And I think that's what brings them into the political arena.
But
the great irony is that they turned dramatically against him within 4 years, and that's part of what we're talking about.
Well, yeah,
today.
I mean, yes, in that sense, there's a sort of tragedy in this, but from his standpoint. But he was also very, very strongly committed to the separation of church and state, correct? And
Yes,
it was that commitment. Am I wrong? I mean, what role did he play in the removal of the tax-exempt status of these private Christian academies, given his commitments to church-state separation. Is there a direct line there?
Actually, he played virtually no role whatsoever.
Oh, he did not. Oh, okay.
He did not.
Well, then we have to
Right.
clarify. Then, yeah, it was my misunderstanding. I thought
No, that's fine.
and I thought
No,
that they turned against him in great measure because of his role of taking away their tax-exempt status. But you're saying that's not the case.
They did turn against him, but that is because the leaders of the religious right lied about his role. So I'll give you a date.
Okay,
here.
this is more complex. Okay.
It is. I'll give you a date here and you'll be able to figure this out quickly.
Right.
All right. When I tell you that Bob Jones University lost its tax-exempt status on January 19th, 1976.
January 19th, the day before Carter was inaugurated.
No.
January 19th, that was 1977. Okay.
A year before.
Yes.
A year and a day.
A year and a day. Yes. Okay.
January 19th, 1976 was an important day for Carter, but not because he had anything to do with this. That was the day he won a plurality at the Iowa precinct caucuses on his way to the Democratic nomination. He had nothing to do about it.
Okay.
But in the 1980 campaign, he was blamed for it.
Right.
That's the mendacity. That's the mendacity behind this. So the real story, you have to go back. You talked about Brown v. Board of Education, May 17th, 1954. Absolutely right. You also had the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right.
And then the desegregation of these public schools. Well, in particular, in Holmes County, Mississippi, the first year of integration, the number of white students in the public schools dropped from over 700 to 28. The second year of integration, that number dropped to 0. And at the same time, 3 segregation academies, church-related, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status.
Right.
And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, wait a minute, this isn't right. So they filed suit. That suit was joined with another suit. It goes, the legal process, as you know, can be a bit complicated. Finally made it up to the district court for the District of Columbia and they issued the ruling on June 30th, 1971, which happens to be also the same date that the Supreme Court issued its ruling on the Pentagon Papers case, by the way, which I think is why this lower court ruling hasn't gotten the attention that it really deserves. And on that date, June 30th, 1971, the district court for the District of Columbia said that any institution that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution, and therefore has no claim on tax-exempt status.
Right.
And as the IRS in the 1970s, initially under Nixon, then under Ford, began to enforce that ruling on these segregation academies, that is what got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Right. So it really precedes Jimmy Carter by quite a bit.
It does, but he's blamed for it, in part because a lot of the enforcement took place during his administration. Now, when I was writing my biography of Carter, I asked him if he knew what Jerome Kurtz was doing. That is, Jerome Kurtz was the commissioner in the Internal Revenue Service who was trying to enforce this. And that's what kicked up all the resistance. And Carter said, no, I did not know that Kurtz was doing that, because he regarded the IRS as being at least somewhat independent from his administration. But yes, Carter gets blamed for it. He's not responsible.
Yeah, but let me ask you, I mean, this gets thicker and thicker. Why do the evangelicals turn their back on their own? Why blame Carter for that if he was not? One would assume that they could at least be more moderate in their, in their sensibilities towards their feelings towards Carter in that regard. Why was the rejection so stark? And there must have been other reasons, right?
I mean, I think it's another thing that on the face of it, it confounds me. But I think what was going on at that time, and I kind of remember this certainly, the leaders of the religious right, Falwell and certainly Wyrick and his Confederates were were ginning up this rhetoric against Carter. And let's remember, Carter was having a tough time as president. I don't think anybody would deny that. It was not a good time to be president of the United States in the late 1970s. So there were other things, and they just kind of piled on with this issue as well. And Carter, of course, had a well-known position being in favor of civil rights and equal protection under the law. So that made him, I think, an easy target for this sort of rhetoric. But again, it wasn't Carter who initiated this. It happened under the Carter and under the Nixon and the Ford administrations.
Yeah, but it's sort of interesting. I mean, I want to get to Donald Trump in a little bit, but the evangelicals turned their back on their own, Jimmy Carter, and embraced Ronald Reagan, who almost never went to church. Maybe his religion was astrology and New Age. I don't know, pick that up from his wife. I mean, he was not a religious figure at all, as Donald Trump, of course, is not. But it's interesting that they became, when they entered the political fray, they entered, in effect, so vehemently and so rapidly in that regard. I mean, it was a stark repoliticization. It doesn't seem as if it was a slow progression, but the seeds of it must have been laid beforehand and so forth. No,
I think that's right, and I think, and actually, what accelerates this is the abortion issue. Now,
okay.
I already talked about the abortion issue, abortion myth. So let's go back and talk about abortion, how abortion became part of this.
Yes,
and it really was. It fell into their lap. First of all, Weyrich was cagey enough. I sometimes call him the evil genius. He was cagey enough to recognize that once he had gotten the attention of Falwell and these other leaders, Robert Billings and others, on the issue of racial segregation in evangelical schools, he still needed another issue if he was going to mobilize grassroots evangelicals. So he did a two-part move, pardon me, which in retrospect was brilliant. First of all, he very cannily shifted the issue from a defense of racial segregation to a defense, and he wrote one of the pages for the modern religious right playbook, to a defense of religious freedom. Okay? All the while failing to mention that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. You and I know that very well, right? Tax exemption is a form of public subsidy because everybody else has to pitch in a little bit more in order to pay for fire service, police protection, parks, national defense, everything else, right? So, but he was very clever about this. Oh, our religious freedom is being attacked. So that's his first move. His second move is to find another issue. And like I said, it really fell into his lap. In advance of the 1978 midterm elections, Weyrich went to Bill Brock, head of the Republican National Committee. At that time, he was a former senator from Tennessee. And Weyrich asked Brock for some money to help mobilize evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at Weyrich and said, "Are you crazy? Who are these people? I'm not going to give any money for this." Whereupon Weyrich resolved to go out and elect some improbable people in the 1978 midterm elections in order to demonstrate the potential for these evangelical voters. He focused on 4 Senate races, one of them in New Hampshire, one in Iowa, and then 2 in Minnesota, one of them for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale. In all 4 races, the Democratic nominees, according to the polls and the pundits, were comfortably ahead going into the election. But on the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 of the favored Democratic candidates lost to anti-abortion Republicans. Now, I remember being out in Laramie, Wyoming, going through Paul Weyrich's papers at the University of Wyoming and coming across his correspondence surrounding this midterm election in 1978. And it's almost like the papers started to sizzle because he realized that he'd finally found the issue that was going to galvanize grassroots evangelicals politically. 2 months later, Frank Schaeffer begins touring the country with a multi-part film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, in many ways the intellectual godfather of the religious right, and a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop. And as that film series begins to circulate among evangelicals, evangelicals start to get clued in on the abortion issue. Now, the reason I hedged that a little bit is that Frank, who's become a good friend actually, Frank insists that the audience response was pretty tepid, actually, in the first 3 months of 1979. Nothing in comparison to a previous film series that he had done called How Shall We Then Live? So, nevertheless, the abortion issue is starting to circulate in evangelical circles. And then, as I said earlier, even as late as August 22nd, 1980, the Reagan campaign wasn't sure that the abortion issue was going to work for them before this crowd of evangelicals. So abortion does come into the picture, but it comes in very, very late in advance of the 1980 presidential election.
Okay, that explains the political context and circumstance. What it doesn't explain is the deeper psychological, socio-psychological, certainly religious motivation for the attraction of the abortion issue to the evangelical subculture in such a way that it's been elevated to be the jewel in the crown of their political organizing. There's, as you've pointed out, and is well known, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are totally silent on the issue of abortion. And it's often, by contrast, rendered that the Bibles, in effect, cite our obligation to the poor maybe thousands of times, right? And so forth. And yet abortion, where the Bible is silent, becomes the issue. So one has to say there is something about that issue that catches the psychological, moral, sociological, religious imagination of evangelicals. And I'm still perplexed as to why that issue. What is it about abortion that, I mean, it's long been, as you point out, long been a Catholic issue, that's for sure. Going back to, I mean, the point of personhood and when the fetus is ensouled has changed within Catholic theology, but it's long been for, well over 1,500 years has been a Catholic issue. It has not been a Protestant issue. Why this issue? What is it about it that captures the imagination of evangelicals?
It's a great question, Joe, and I've been puzzling over it for a long time, and I have a kind of a provisional answer for it, but I will just simply reaffirm what you said about the Bible being silent on the issue. You can tug and pull at a couple sort of recondite passages and maybe come up with something that might sort of justify that position. But as you say, it's certainly a whole lot more ambiguous than what Jesus has to say about poverty and prisons and and widows and the hungry and so forth. I actually tried to figure this out a long time ago. When I was writing my second book, My Eyes Have Seen the Glory, I went to Iowa for the Iowa precinct caucuses in 1988. This is when religious right activists were first really entering the political process at the grassroots level, gearing up to attend the Iowa precinct caucuses, which they hadn't up until that time. And it was an important election, as you know, of course, because this was the election to replace Ronald Reagan. So there was a lot of energy surrounding that. And I remember very clearly having a conversation with the head of the Iowa chapter of Concerned Women for America, which, as you know, is the religious right counterpoint to NOW, the National Organization of Women. Her name was Maxine Seelman. And I remember very clearly, she kind of leaned toward me and pointed in my direction and with very intense eyes. And she said, remember, the most dangerous place to be these days is inside a mother's womb. And I've been haunted by that declaration really ever since, because of the intensity that that was behind that declaration. So I began to kind of think about this, and I wondered if there is some, as you suggested in your question, some sort of psychological or sociological or some other explanation for why there's this identification with abortion. And I wondered if there's some way in which evangelicals identify with the precariousness of a fetus. That is to say, for much of the 20th century, they saw themselves, and they still do actually, because of this rhetoric of victimization, they see themselves as being beset upon and somehow precarious in their position. And there's this marvelous sort of Freudian psychoanalytical notion of crawling back into the mother's womb, into the safety of the womb, to escape the buffetings of the larger world. And I don't know if that explanation has any merit or not, frankly. And when I published it, a lot of people thought it did, a lot of people thought it didn't. So I don't know how to judge that.
Well, it's certainly,
there's an identification, and there's an identification to the kind of victimization that they imputed to a fetus. And I think, just to kind of fast forward to the recent past, I think one of the reasons that evangelicals supported Donald Trump, and I think there are really three reasons, but one of them is he speaks the language of victimization very, very well, and they identify with that. He speaks it probably better than anybody I've ever encountered. It's always about him. He's the victim always, but that's a very important element in his political rise, it seems to me. And I think, in a way, they wanted to see themselves as being victimized, and so there was an identification with the fetus that may help to explain why the issue took hold. I think the other issue is, as many people have pointed out, is that it's a fairly low-cost political position to take. That is to say, a fetus doesn't demand healthcare, a fetus doesn't demand an education, a fetus does not demand food, and so you can advocate for the fetus without really paying the price, so to speak, in terms of actual policies.
Well, that there is an implied cynicism in that, I guess, in a certain way. I guess so. But I mean, as you're talking about identification with the vulnerability of the fetus, I would say, well, yeah, well, I mean, clearly your rendition is highly speculative, right? I mean, there's no way to really clearly resolve that issue. But I'm just wondering, if it's a question of identification with the vulnerable, why is there not an equal concern among evangelicals of impoverished children in Appalachia? They're vulnerable, and they come from evangelical backgrounds. Why aren't they banging the drums for federal programs that'll support poor kids in the rural South, or whatever?
And I think that point is the reason that some people call this movement not pro-life but pro-birth. I mean,
right.
There's really an abandonment of the child once the child is born, and I don't want to be too general about that statement, because there are exceptions to it, but I think it is largely true.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, certain points you make here really caught my attention very stridently, and I would like to be able to better understand where the evangelical movement is at these days, when one basically contrasts their political commitments with what you might construe to be traditional biblical ethical values, right? And what's happened to them. And you make one remark that caught my eye. You say it's on page 79 of your book. You said, whatever else the case, having thereby forfeited their prophetic voice, leaders of the movement and the religious right itself have become little more than a political interest group. That's a very categorical statement. And I'm wondering if you can, I mean, that's the way, as an outsider, in effect, that it certainly appears that way to me. I haven't stepped inside an evangelical church. I know, Randy, if I may say, you come from that background.
Yeah.
So the question is, I mean, to what extent has the evangelical movement been virtually drained of biblical values? You talked about their liberal outlook in the 19th century. I mean, it sounds as if that is in effect, has been consigned to the dustbin of history. And what you have now, in a sense, is a massive political movement, and ethical values that concern themselves with the least of our brethren seem not to be of particular interest at all. I mean, how do we understand the current, at this moment, the current moral temperature of the evangelical churches?
I think your assessment is absolutely correct. I think this is a movement that has lost its soul. I make the point in the book, and actually I've made it, I think, many times, at least in various forums. But my sense of American religious history is that the most effective religious groups, in terms of maintaining fidelity to their stated or claimed principles, are those on the margins of society and not in the councils of power. I think once a movement or once a religious leader begins to hanker after political power or influence, he or she loses the prophetic voice. And I think there are all sorts of examples of that, but I think the religious right is probably the best example I can think of, where you have a movement that evangelicals very much saw themselves on the margins of society. And this is the world in which I grew up, as you know. And once they began to accrue political power, they lost their prophetic voice. When I was growing up, the most damning thing you could say about a fellow believer was that she or he was worldly. And that meant all sorts of things. Worldly meant all sorts of things. It meant sexual misbehavior, drug or alcohol abuse. It also meant affluence and a lust after affluence. And I think as the religious right has emerged, as it did in the late 1970s, the prophetic voice has disappeared. We saw ourselves, when I was growing up, not only as a subculture, but as a counterculture. And that has entirely been lost. It's still a subculture in many ways. That is, evangelicalism still has its own celebrities, its own language, its own music, its own mores, but it's no longer a counterculture. It has, I think, sold itself out to the larger culture. And I think that's a tragedy. The sort of noble legacy of Charles Grandison Finney and other 19th century evangelical reformers has been lost. And I'm not sure that most evangelicals know that that's part of their history. In some ways, in many ways, what I've been trying to do, Joe, over the last several decades is to call them back to that tradition. And you can see how successful I've been.
I'm not sure they read your books, but right. But another phrase that you include that caught my attention particularly is that you state that the abortion, I think it's page 80, the abortion myth conceals an uglier truth. And that is, I mean, you talk about, again, race and the rise of the religious right. I mean, what you seem to imply, and I'll state it boldly and qualify it, if you will, that really what lies behind the political interests and perhaps the political identity of the Christian right effectively is racism. That the abortion myth hides the racism that is endemic. Now, of course, we have to clarify there are Black evangelical churches, right? So we have to clarify. We're talking about white evangelical churches. Right. That it basically that they are racist. I mean, this is what the implication, reading that, this is what the implication to my mind was in upholding the abortion, sustaining the abortion myth. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I'm pretty careful not to accuse evangelicals of being racist itself, but I will say that racism lies at the heart of their movement. And, this is the foundation of the movement. And I also try to make the point that unrepented racism festers. And I think that helps to explain how we get to 2016 and 2020 with the overwhelming white, as you point out very rightly, there are Black evangelicals, overwhelming white evangelical support for Donald Trump. And as you point out, this is not the family values candidate. This is a movement that has trumped its support for family values for more than 4 decades now. I think what happened, what happened in 2016 is that they finally had to drop the pretense that this was a movement about family values and acknowledge that you just can't.
Now, state it again, if you will, the embrace of Donald Trump. What is the attraction?
Well, I think it is racism. I think it. No, okay. Again, I want to be careful not to say that all evangelicals are racist, because I don't think that's true, and I have no way of judging that anyway. But I think the attraction is racism. And by the way, I think the bridge figure between the origins of the religious right in defense of racism and Donald Trump in 2016 is Ronald Reagan. And this became very clear to me as I was doing research for the book. Reagan got into politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which sought to guarantee equal access for both rental housing and the purchase of homes. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his campaigns, he frequently invoked that racially charged phrase, law and order. And you certainly can't forget his vile caricature of so-called welfare queens, women of color, supposedly living off the dole in lives of luxury. He was never able to produce one of these welfare queens, but he talked as though they existed. He decimated the Civil Rights Commission as president. He maintained staunch support of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And for me, the most persuasive moment was August 3rd, 1980, when he opened his general election campaign for the presidency in, of all places, the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's office, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers.
Yes.
And Reagan was the master of symbolism. Lest anyone miss his meaning. On that occasion, he invoked that age-old segregationist battle cry, I believe in states' rights.
Yes.
So the line from the religious right in the 1970s to Donald Trump in 2016 loops through Ronald Reagan. I don't think there's any way to avoid that.
Yeah, I wish we had a lot more time, because there's a whole encyclopedia of questions I have for you, but there are 2 that concern me a great deal in this moment, and are related. They're somewhat tangential, but overlap to some degree too with what we've been talking about. I'm very concerned about the destruction of the separation of church and state, the wall of separation that's being destroyed. I mean, I guess I was socialized out of the heyday of the liberal Supreme Court and William Brennan, Thurgood Marshall, William O. Douglas, and Hugo Black, most of all, who were champions of separation. And what we have now is a replacing doctrine of religious accommodation, where the government can accommodate religion, including supporting it through financial support, which would have caused James Madison to turn over in his grave. I mean, it's just
Sure.
so
Very
contrary to American principles. I also see in our country, I'm not going to make a global statement out of it, but in our country, that the separation of church and state is really a foundation for democracy in this country, which is, I think, again, hanging by a thread at the moment. I see religion taking over the public square in a way that I think is very dangerous to democracy and ultimately to religious freedom. Think Hobby Lobby, for example, which is evangelical, business people and so forth. I'm wondering to what extent, whether you have any thoughts about that and the role of the evangelical world in basically destroying, moving religion further into the public square generally and eroding this wall of separation.
I couldn't agree more, Joe. I'm aghast at these recent rulings. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, I suppose, given the composition of the Supreme Court. But this is ruinous, and I'm going to defend the separation of church and state from a different angle from yours. Not that I disagree with yours, I certainly do, but I'm going to defend it from the point of religious interests.
Yes.
And we go back to Roger Williams and the separation of church and state. He's the person who really introduced this metaphor, the wall of separation. But if you look carefully what Roger Williams was saying, he wanted to separate the garden of the churk from the wilderness of the world.
Yes, right. Yes.
By means of a wall of separation.
Right.
And as I lay this out, I always say, Roger Williams and the people of the 17th century were not members of the Sierra Club. That is, right. They did not share our romantic notions about wilderness. Wilderness for them was a place of darkness and danger. Right. This is what Satan loved. And when he wants to separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, what he's concerned about is the integrity of the faith. So I'm a passionate defender of the separation of church and state, not only because it's in the First Amendment, which it certainly is, but because that is the way to protect the integrity of the faith from too close association with the state. And it's just utterly confounds me that you have all these people in the religious right who are pushing for the collapse of this wall of separation, and it's against their own interests. And I'll go further to say that religion has flourished in this country as nowhere else, precisely because of the separation of church and state. And it's a terrible mistake. It's a mistake for everybody, for secularists as well as for people of faith.
Well, I should say personally, Randy, I might surprise you that I stand on both sides of the two clauses of the First Amendment, and I have testified before legislative bodies in defending religious freedom and so forth against encroachment by the state and so forth. So I'm on the same page there in that regard. But I wanted to loop back in a moment to the point you're making about the interests, the self-interest of religion and so forth being eroded by, in effect, the assault on the separation, which I mean, it doesn't serve their interests from my point of view, but we'll get to that in a moment. We have to bring this to a close, unfortunately, I think, but I wanted to bring another issue. You talk about racism standing behind, and broader racism standing behind the contemporary evangelical movement. I want to talk about misogyny. And I see that in the Dobbs decision as well, and so forth. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think what's so tragic about that is that, as I suggested earlier, evangelicals in the 19th century were supporting women's rights, supporting women's equality. They even took the radical position that women should be allowed to vote in the 19th century. That was considered very radical. And to have this sort of turnaround where there's such a little regard for women's autonomy and women's rights, I think is just represents a terrible disservice to the tradition. Also, I would argue to the words of Jesus. I mean, look the way Jesus treated women in the New Testament. Jesus was he lived in a patriarchal society. I don't think there's any question about that. We have to acknowledge that. But especially given those constraints, he did not demean women. He did not look down on them. He did not treat them as inferior beings. And I think that should be a model for evangelicals today, all Christians, everybody for that.
Yeah, one word on church-state separation. Again, I mean, I would argue, as you already have so well, that the preservation of the separation of church and state serves the interests of religious flourishing. I mean, if you want to basically destroy religion, the best way to do it is employ the state to shove it down people's throats. Absolutely. And in effect, you will then become anti-religious. And we see various cultures in which this happens, in effect. So I'm wondering why evangelicals are so fervent in basically getting the government to enable their religion, knowing that, in effect, it will not over the long range serve their interests. And which leads me to the question of where evangelicals are today. Are they continuing to grow? I mean, I look at the Bush administration as being their high watermark with mega churches and so forth. Are they beginning to shrink? Is the next generation becoming disenchanted?
I think there's some statistical, I don't follow polling all that closely because I'm not sure I trust it entirely, but I think there's some evidence that yes, the numbers are receding a little bit. My sense, again, more anecdotally than anything else, is that there's a growing generation gap among evangelical families. And there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, it's very difficult to pass religious faith or religious fervor in particular from one generation to the next. I think that's one issue. But also, I think younger generation simply doesn't share the same sorts of passions or prejudices that their parents do on issues of LGBT rights, for example, or sexual identity. The younger generation, or abortion for that matter, the younger generation just doesn't, they don't get it. They don't understand why there's such a passion among their parents and their parents' peers on that issue. And so I think, yes, the numbers are declining. I think there's all sorts of suggestion that there's a disaffection, a growing disaffection among many evangelicals. And I think part of it has to do with the crass politicization of the movement over the last several decades. Right.
Okay, I've got to bring this to an end in a few minutes, but there are a few more questions I have. I read, let me turn to page 85, 86. You say at the bottom of 85, you say, once this is sort of a conclusion to your text. You say, once evangelicals come to terms with the abortion myth and the racism baked into the religious right, I dare to hope that they might then re-examine other aspects of their political agenda, an agenda that has been inordinately dictated by the fusion of the religious right with the far-right precincts of the Republican Party. When I read that, I hate to say it, Randy, I know you've been disillusioned by the current purveyors of the heritage in which you have basically the background that you've had and the traditions in which you were raised. But I read that and said, gee, that would be that's a nice thought, but I'm wondering if there's a lot of wishful thinking in that.
Oh, I'm sure there is.
I mean, do you see any sign at all that evangelicals are, well, there may be divisions that we don't know about, but that evangelicals might indeed be rethinking the stridency of their political agenda in ways that they realize, gee, this is not, it's not loyal, it's not faithful to our biblical heritage, our values, our history, and so forth. And it's doing us a disservice in the long run. I mean, is there any reason to believe that internally there may be some mitigation of the political stridency that we see?
Well, again, it is wishful thinking. You're absolutely right about that. But there are individuals, organizations. I think about the Sojourners, for example. They've been flying the flag for a long time, and I think really quite thoughtfully and impressively in many ways. People like Shane Claiborne or Lisa Sharon Harper, the older generation, Tony Campolo, Ron Sider, sadly recently passed away, but he was, I think, in that camp. I had some reservations with some of his positions, but he would be another example of that. And I think there is a younger generation kind of wanting to take their place. How soon and how effectively, I don't know about that. But like I said, I've taken it as sort of my task not to be so much an activist on the front lines or the picket lines or whatever it might be, but through writing and scholarship
Sure.
and op-ed and so forth, trying to spread the words, trying to spread the gospel.
Right, very good. Well, I think that may be a good place to end. You've had an extraordinary career as a scholar and as a public intellectual, bringing these issues to bear. They're certainly extremely relevant and very gripping, and particularly relevant at this political moment. Just one last question. Before we started, you did show me what your latest creation. Why don't you let our viewers know what your
sure, happy to do that.
Right. Right.
It's called Passion Plays:
Right.
How Religion Shaped Sports in North America. And it's actually a book I've been thinking about for 40 years, from all the way back to my graduate school days. I had my mentor in graduate school, not John Wilson, the man Joe, but John Murrin in the history department was an avid sports fan. And he used to talk about the symbolism surrounding the four major team sports in North America. I'm sorry, three. He never talked about hockey, but I put hockey in there. And for example, baseball is the quintessential immigrant game because it's the only game where the defense controls the ball and the offensive player, the batter, his task is to disrupt the defense's control of the ball. He's outnumbered 9-1. And if he fails 7 times out of 10, he'll go to the Hall of Fame. And out in that hostile world, there are 3 islands of safety: first, second, and third base. And of course, the greatest triumph is to return home. So anyway, the book tries to understand the 4 major team sports in terms of not only their history, but the symbolism surrounding that. Football is a military game, of course. Concerned with the conquest and the defense of territory. Hockey is Canada's game, and that's a fascinating story there. And finally, basketball is the quintessential urban game because it replicates life in the city, maneuvering within a constricted space without impeding the progress of others.
Unbelievably creative, right?
It's a fun book.
That is really great. So maybe it's time to bring this really delightful and engaging conversation to an end. Randy, it's been great seeing you again. Right. I wish
Wonderful,
you well.
Joe.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so very,
too.
very much. Yeah. And I want to thank our viewers for tuning in as well. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.